So this video is about assessment. Um, this is something to do with determining how your students are performing. Also, it may have something to do with the grades that you give your students. But assessment is not uh, primarily about grades. It's about observing your students and see what type of improvement is happening to them. So when we say assessment, we are doing a number of things. We are gathering information from our students. We want to know what they know. We are recording information. And when we record that information, we interpret based on the information that we have observed here. How are my students doing? Do they need more assistance? Do they need help with their classwork? Which of my students need more help than the other students? So really, the purpose of assessment is to interpret the information that we obtain from our students. Now, how do we use this information? So once we obtain this information, once we have gathered the information, recorded it, interpreted it, we use it for several functions. I think the biggest function is to enhance learning, is to make sure that our students have learned from what we are teaching or from the activities that we are doing with them. Another use of this information is for promotion, like promoting students from one class to another or from one stream to another. So you can use assessment for that. College admissions, exams like the tests like ACT, SAT. So those are important for college admission. So that is part of assessment. And also we have assessment for certification. Like we are talking about high school certificates, college certificates. So that is part of assessment. Now, really, when we talk about assessment, there are two types of assessment. So these two types based on what you want to obtain from the assessment. So the first type is assessment for learning. Normally, this is what we call formative assessment. The second type is assessment of learning. This is what we call summative assessment. So how are these two types of assessment different? Assessment for learning versus assessment of learning. In assessment for learning, The users of that assessment are primarily teachers, students, and parents. So teacher can use assessment to improve students' learning. The student can use the assessment to improve him or herself. The parents can use the assessment to see where their kids are, or maybe to also help the kids. In summative, also it is teachers, but now we have principals, supervisors, and policymakers are the primary users. So the summative assessment or assessment of learning is usually used by more by the outsiders than the students themselves. When does assessment take place? Assessment for learning takes place during the learning process itself as the students are in the classroom. In summative, uh, in terms of assessment of learning, the assessment takes place after learning. So, like your students will write an exam after they have learned. They can write a final at the end of the semester. What is the use of the assessment? So, assessment for learning is used to provide information on what and how to improve achievement. So, really, this type of assessment is looking at the student, him or herself, is looking at the improvement of learning of a student. In assessment of learning, assessment is used to certify student competence. So it is mostly about certification. Is the student competent enough after learning maybe for one semester or 1 year or 4 years? Now, how do teachers use these two types of assessment? So, in assessment for learning, teachers use this type of assessment to identify and respond to student needs. So, this is an immediate type of assessment where you observe that your students are lacking something, and then you want to go on and solve that problem. Assessment of learning is usually used to rank and sort students. So it's about ranking, like competitive. Also, in terms of the purpose, assessment for learning, its purpose is to improve learning. Assessment of learning, the purpose is documentation. Uh, Document achievement of standards. So we have these standards. Has this student achieved the standards? Also, what is the primary motivator of each assessment? Really, in assessment for learning, we believe that success is achievable by any student. In assessment of learning, it is mostly a threat of punishment. So the motivation is to provide kind of a punishment, like if you don't pass, you cannot go to the next class. If you don't pass, you are not going to get a reward. So it's either punishment or promise of a reward. What is the timeline of each of these two assessments? Assessment for learning is continuous. It's occurring every time. Every time you are doing group discussion in your classroom, you are assessing your students. Every time they have a short essay, a short quiz, a clicker question, that is assessment for learning. In the assessment of learning, it is periodic. So you can say, I have 3 exams this semester. Those 3 exams have specific dates. They are periodic. In terms of the examples, assessment for learning, we have peer assessment, rubric use with students, descriptive feedback from the teacher, assessments of group discussions, reflections, so all sorts of things. In terms of formative assessment, it's mainly final exams, placement placement tests like the ACTs and the like, state assessments, and unit tests. So those are part of assessment of learning. So you can see that when we are talking about assessment, we need to specify what type of assessment are we dealing with. What are the guiding questions for appropriate assessments? So when you are making your assessment, you need to think about these things. What are your essential and enduring skills and content that you are trying to assess? Do you want to assess their skill in questioning? Do you want to assess their skill in solving problems? Do you want to assess their skill in self-directing? What about the content? Uh, do you have a specific content that you want to assess your students? Do you want them to know about electricity or about energy or about matter and its properties? How does the assessment allow students to demonstrate mastery? So what are you going to do? What are you going to give your students to demonstrate that they understand the material? Are you giving them a multiple choice test? Are you giving them short answer exams? Or are you giving them an essay? Are you giving them a discussion? So you need to figure out what you want to give them for them to show mastery of the material. Is every component of that objective accounted for in the assessment? So normally when you create your specific objectives, you want your assessment to cover all of those specific objectives. If one of the specific objectives is for your students to interpret something, you need to have an assessment that asks them to interpret things. Can students respond another way and still satisfy the requirements of the assessment task? You can give your students leeway. Can they do something by writing, or can they do the same thing but now orally, just talking to you? Can they do something by thinking aloud? So you can ask yourself, can I assess the same skill by a different method? And also another thing you can think about is this assessment more a test of process or content? What do you want them to learn? Do you want them to learn more about science, the scientific method, or do you want them to learn the content from the discipline? So you need to answer all these questions for you to determine what sort of assessment you want to use. Some assessment you can focus on the process. Other assessments you can focus on the content. But you need to make that decision at the beginning. So, just to repeat, in terms of our assessment, really we have two major types of assessment, which are summative, which we, as we already indicated, we call assessment of learning, and formative assessment, which is the assessment for learning. In the summative, your focus is to capture learning at one point. Usually, you are looking at standardized tests, unit tests, and the like. So, really, what you are looking for in this type of assessment is, did my students achieve the required standards? Maybe to go to another class or to go to a specific college. So it is about achieving a specific mastery of knowledge. While formative assessment, we focus on the process itself, the learning process. That's what we are trying to assess, which means you want to increase student learning. And for you to be able to do that, your students need to know the progress of their learning, which means feedback is very important. So you need to make sure that you are giving clear feedback to your students. Actually, based on what you are observing in this formative assessment, you can change your instruction. That's the whole purpose of formative assessment, to give you a leeway to be able to change your instruction based on where you think your students are. So these are the major differences between these two types of assessment, the summative assessment and the formative assessment. Most of the things that we do in class, group discussions, clicker questions, uh, maybe bringing the classroom together, the making meaning conference, all those things are formative assessment, because we are trying to find out where the students are. How do my students understand whatever we are doing? So now, if we have to focus on the formative assessment itself, what are the key elements of formative assessment? So the first part is, you need to identify the learning goals as a teacher. What are the intentions or outcomes? And do you have a specific criteria for achieving these? What types of activities are you going to introduce in your class, or are you going to use in your class to make sure that the outcomes and the criteria are achieved? Also, formative assessment focuses on rich conversations between teachers and students. And you want to deepen this conversation as the semester is going on. So you want to continually build and go deeper with these conversations, especially as the students are getting used to these classroom discussions or conversations. Also, an important part of formative assessment is to be able to provide timely feedback, because the purpose is to make sure that your students improve in their learning. So you want your students to advance in their learning by providing that feedback. And you want your students to be actively involved in their own learning. So there are things like you can ask them to reflect upon their learning. You can ask them to tell you how much they have learned. You can ask them to fill a certain card to talk about the objectives and what they think they have learned. So they are involved in their own learning. You can ask them to create experiments. So in this formative assessment, as a teacher, you want to respond to students' learning needs and strengths. You should be able to have this leeway to modify your teaching so that uh, if you have students who have difficulties, your teaching captures those students. So actually, for effective formative assessment, your students should be able to answer these three basic questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? How can I close the gap? So if you want your students to know where they are going, you need to give them a clear vision. They need to know the objectives. What are the objectives? What are the goals of the content of the course? And if you want also them to know where they are going, another strategy is to use examples of strong and weak work. So what do we do in strong and weak work? So you can ask your students to write something, and then they come and show it to you, and then you start discussing them with them what they have written. You want them to verbalize, tell you what they have written, and they give you reasons why they have written it that way. Then you can lead them into this discussion. How can we strengthen what you have written here? What changes can we make to specific words or specific terms to make this story strong or to make this work strong? So your students need to be able to identify that what I have written here is a strong work. What I have written here is weak work, but I can improve. So you are trying to improve their understanding of their activities. In terms of answering the question, where am I now? Make sure your students have regular descriptive feedback. So you need to give them enough feedback that can help them change their understanding, that can make them improve their understanding of the material. Also, self-assessment. Give them a chance to self-assess themselves. When they write an exam, have them assess themselves. Give them a rubric and ask them, this is the rubric I want you to assess yourself. So based on the rubric, they can know that I think I made a mistake here, I made a mistake here, I need to improve here. Now, answering the question, how do I close the gap? Really, as a teacher, you want to look at the gaps that your students have and design lessons that focus on specific aspect. If your students have issues with writing, you need to design a lesson that focuses on writing. If they have issues with problem solving, design lessons that focus on problem solving so that you close the gap in their understanding. Teach your students focused revision. So after they do their activities, after you discuss, ask them to revise and improve their work. As I said earlier, you need to engage your students in self-reflection. Let them document the materials, let them share their understanding with their friends, or let them share their learning with you as a teacher. So self-reflection is very important for you to close the gap of your students' understanding. Now let's go back to objectives, assessments, and instructional strategy. As a teacher, when you develop your lesson plan, you want to make sure about one thing. Your lesson plan has these learning objectives. That is what you want your students to know or to learn. Your assessments must align with the learning objectives. So assessments must align with learning objectives. So you don't want your objective. I want my students to be able to explain something. If your objective is about explaining something, your assessment should also be about explaining something. If your objective is judging something, your assessment, in your assessment, they should have something that enables them to judge something. That is what we mean when we say assessments must align with the learning objectives. If your objective is, I want my students to interpret something, in the assessment, give them a graph, let them interpret a graph. That's what it means. And also, there must be alignment. There must be alignment between learning objectives, assessments, and instructional strategies. If you want your students to be able to discuss in groups, give them an activity that will enable them a discussion. If you want your students to synthesize something, give them an essay or give them an activity that will teach them how to synthesize something, and also give them an assessment that will allow them to synthesize something. That's what we mean by alignment of objectives, assessment, and instructional strategies. Now let's look at examples of this. So we know, based on Bloom's taxonomy, we have objectives from recall all the way to evaluation, something like that. So if your objective is about recall, you have specific assessments you can give your students. So you can have multiple choice questions, you can have matching, you can have labeling, you can have fill in the blanks. So these are simple questions that need them to recall. So if you have an objective, I want my students to recall, I want my students to recognize, I want my students to identify, you can give them these types of questions. These types of questions that we have here align with the recall objectives. If you want your students to understand, so in this case, they should interpret exemplify, classify, summarize, infer, compare, and explain. If you want your students to be able to do that, these are the types of activities that you can give them. Ask them to summarize something. Ask them to compare and contrast. Give them an activity that will enable them to classify, to categorize cases, elements, or something. Give them an activity that will allow them to paraphrase something, to identify, to find something. So if your objective is about application, so here we have apply, execute, implement. Give them activities that will enable them apply, execute, implement. So like lab activities, um, simulations or prototyping. Give them some problems that they can solve, familiar and familiar problems. That is tasks that need application. So based on that, you can say, you know what, my activities here, actually my assessment here aligns with the application section. Now, if you want them to do analysis, give them activities that will enable them to analyze. Ask them to discriminate or select relevant and irrelevant parts. Ask them to determine how elements function together. Ask them to determine bias, values, underlying intent in presented material. So those objectives, these activities align with these objectives. If you want them to evaluate things, yeah, give them things like journals, diaries, critiques, problem sets, product reviews, or studies that require them to monitor, to judge, to critique. So these are the kinds of activities that will align with the evaluation part of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, if you want them to create, generate, so this is synthesis. If you want them to synthesize something, yeah, give them something to synthesize. Give them a research project, an essay, a business plan, web design, or just let them build something. Give them an opportunity to build something from the first principles. So really, when you are creating your activities for assessment, you need to make sure that all your assessment you are putting, all your assessment you are having in your lesson plan align with the objectives that you have. So in your next lesson plan, I want to see that your assessments align with the objectives. Because the whole purpose of assessment is to see if your objectives have been achieved. So, what are the keys to classroom quality assessment? So, there are 5 keys that we use. You need to have clear purpose, clear targets, sound design, effective communication, and student involvement. So let's look at these keys. So in terms of clear purpose, first you need to identify the users of your classroom assessment. You need to understand formative and summative assessment and when to use them and how to use them. In terms of clear targets, you need to identify what your learning targets are. You need to know how to come up with goals and objectives. What are my specific objectives? What are my goals for this class? When you are planning your lesson, you need to have clear learning targets, what you want your students to learn, and translate the targets in a form that your students are going to understand. So that is the clear targets part. In terms of sound design of assessment, probably the assessment must serve its purpose. The assessment must easily achieve its learning targets. And really, if you are giving a grade in that assessment, you need to make sure that you are using a fair type of assessment. So a good scoring rubric or scoring guide that meets standards of quality. And you want to avoid bias in your assessment. What this means is two students should be assessed equitably, or I can say equally. And effective communication is an important part. So you want to use the assessment for improvement or to plan instruction, offer feedback to your students. You want to record this type of assessment, formative and summative, accurately. The information itself should be combined and summarized appropriately. Your assessment must reflect the current level of student learning. So you don't want to give them assessment that is at a very high level or that is at a very low level. And in every assessment, you want to involve your students. So the students try to make sure that your students know the objectives, they know the learning targets, and also give them a chance for peer feedback, self-assessment. Involve your students in tracking their own learning. You can use reflections, or they share their own learning with the class, or they share their own learning with you. So just make sure that your assessment is sound, it involves your students, and it is achieving clear targets. So I'll give you a handout on formative assessment that should help you to determine what types of assessment you can give your students. Thank you.